Welcome everyone. We're here to share with you part of our webinar series today on housing, homelessness, and functional zero from the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. I hope everyone is having a fantastic day. It is kind of rainy and gray where I am, so happy to have this little bit of sunshine in my day. All right, so we'll just get started. My name is Randalin Ellery. I'm the Director of Data Impact and Policy, and I am lucky to be sharing the time today with Jessica Brunet, who is our data advisor at CAEH. And of course, we want to begin our day just by acknowledging the land that we are on. I am in Guelph, Ontario, so I'm currently occupying the ancestral lands of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Peoples and Treaty Lands and Territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And Jess, where are you joining us today?
I am joining you from a community that I live and work in, which is now called Windsor, Essex, and I acknowledge that it is the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, and it's comprised of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples.
Excellent, thank you. I really welcome and encourage people to use the chat. If you would like to say hi, let us know where you're coming from today. If you'd like to take a second to acknowledge the land you're on, I always find it really interesting to see where folks are, and also gives me an opportunity to learn about the land as well. So please feel free to use the chat function for that. A little bit of housekeeping we will get started with before we get into the content. I am sure many of you are familiar with CAEH. We're a national movement of individuals, organizations, and communities working together to end homelessness in Canada. And we have a host of things that we focus on. One of them is our national conference on ending homelessness. We skipped out on last year due to the pandemic, but are excited to come back together this year virtually and use it as an opportunity to share all of what we are learning across the country. So I know that a call for presentations just went out recently, so we'll keep giving more info, but there's also the website there if you want to follow along. We also have the two different programs, the Built for Zero Canada and the TTA, the Training and Technical Assistance, both great opportunities for your communities to connect into, learn, get some support, coaching, hear about what others are doing, lots of opportunities there. And then we have our allied networks. I think there's about 5 or 6 of them now. They're growing all the time. Allied networks focused on folks with lived experience, our rural and remote network, our health and housing. Again, lots of opportunities to get involved, and I encourage folks to check out the different allied networks and see where you might want to plug in on our website. And then also, as folks know, we do a bunch of advocacy work as well, and really focused on the policy changes needed to end homelessness. We have great lobbyists on our team, and as a data team, we're always happy to provide data so that they can be evidence-informed advocacy that we're doing. But if you ever think we're missing a topic or you want to be part of the conversation, please reach out either to myself or to our CEO, Tim Richter. Yeah, we will always want to hear from folks. So that's a little bit about what we do. Some other housekeeping is just about the Zoom webinar. I think we all should be experts on Zoom at this point, but I am still far from it. But letting folks know that we are recording today, and that if you can't stick around for the whole thing or you want to share it with someone else, you can find it on our TTA website under webinars and then archived webinars. There'll be a recording there. Everyone is muted today, but really encourage you to use the chat if you just want to share your thoughts or any feedback you have as we go along. Please use the chat for that. But if you have specific questions, if you could use the Q&A function, you can just see both of those down at the bottom. That just helps us keep track so that we don't lose questions. So if you have a question, use the Q&A. If you just want to share a thought and put something out there, please use the chat. And yeah, we'll have time at the end for Q&A. So this is a part of monthly community of practice webinars. Many of the other ones are hosted by our BFZ director, Marie Morrison, or Wally Check, who's the director of TTA. So we're happy to squeeze one in here and freshen up the look. But totally encourage folks to go and look at the webinar archive to read past ones or watch past ones, and also to understand like what is coming up, because there's lots of great topics being covered, but even more so, I think it's a good opportunity to share either what's working well in your community, what you're struggling with, and to be able to connect with others. So again, I'm just gonna like pressure you again, not pressure, encourage you to use the chat so that we can make that possible. We are funded partly by the Government of Canada through the CCI funding through Reaching Home. We're super grateful for that and the opportunity to be able to host these webinars. Oh, okay, that's all of our housekeeping items. So a little bit of our agenda of what we're planning to talk about today. We're going to start with definitions. They're so foundational to this work and to understanding what really needs to be solidified as your community is working towards reductions and achieving functional zero. So we wanted to spend some time talking about those, and again, just encourage feedback. And we might not have all of the answers, but love to hear what you think about some of the definitions we're using, learn about definitions that you're using in your community. I think definitions are evergreen and they evolve. And so, yeah, it's something that we really like to talk about. So we'll start there. We'll go through some of the key definitions included in functional zero. We'll talk a little bit about how that's determined, how it's confirmed from a CAEH perspective, and then have some time for Q&As as well. So that's what we're planning to do today. And I'm going to turn it over to Jess and let her take the lead on definitions.
Thanks, friend. So let's talk about definitions in general for a sec. So before we get into any of like glossary terms, let's just chat about definitions. And for those of you who don't know me, I am Jessica Brunet, and I absolutely love definitions. You will find me in many a meeting and conversations asking about, what do you mean about that? Kind of like the Justin Bieber song, except I say it all the time and sometimes in a sing-song voice. So for me, my love of definitions started at this very specific moment. It was in like a basement classroom when I was in school, and we talked about research methods. We looked at this paragraph, and it was about an essay on democracy. And my professor was like, what do you think this person means by democracy? And someone raised their hand and they said something about the theory of democracy. Someone else raised their hand, they talked about social democracy, participatory democracy. Someone was like, it's about the root word of what democracy means. And so after everyone participated and said all their thoughts, my professor said, if you don't know what the author meant by democracy, how would you know how to read the rest of this paper? And for me, that was like this moment where I realized if we don't talk about our terms, we won't understand where we're going. So if there's anything you take from today, there are 3 evergreen, to use that wonderful word Randalin said, things I want you to remember about definitions. It's in absolute terms, a definition should always be clear, consistent, and revisited. So let's talk about what we mean by those 3 things. In each of these 3 things, I will have the definition up on the left-hand side of the screen. So definitions need to be clear. When we look at this definition on the left-hand side of the word definition, little definitionception, if you will, we notice there's not a lot of flourishy language, right? It's super succinct, to the point, very simple language, which leads to one of my favorite quotes by Einstein, is that if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough. Something I like to think about when I'm supporting someone in learning a new topic or helping someone with data, especially, because sometimes you feel a little overwhelmed with all the terminology. I just take it back. What is it? What am I trying to tell someone in the simplest way? Similarly, when I'm learning something new, I always ask someone, can you explain it in the simplest terms to me? Then we're on some common understanding and we can move forward. From there, definitions should be consistent. We want it to be the same across the board. However you are defining something, make sure that you are continuously using that definition. This being said, we know the definitions can differ between communities or even reporting, right? When you report to your funder, to the province, to the feds, sometimes you can have different definitions. So long as you use your definitions consistently and you're clear about what you're using, you're totally okay. So there's some little tips I have for how communities can make sure they're being consistent with their definitions. So use initial and ongoing training to make sure everyone's on the same page. One of the easiest ways is if we have definitions recorded somewhere. So make sure that if someone's curious as to, let's say, what your definition of experiencing homelessness is, you have it recorded somewhere. And most importantly, that recorded definition can be quickly and easily accessed by people. Here's an example of a community that I am absolutely in love with. So they realized that in their one program, staff members were defining homelessness and house very differently from staff member to staff member. So what they did was they had a super simple sheet that just said what the two definitions were, highlighted some important questions people would have or wanted to answer, and people were able to print it on their desk. So just right beside you, you had this quick reference, and they noticed from there their data became more consistent. They were able to all have better conversations, and it all was down to a common definition being used consistently. And the last part, again, we're going to use the word evergreen, is that definitions should be revisited. We as a society, we change, we grow, we learn, and so should our words, right? Words are not static, they're dynamic in their definition. What I like to think of is that quarterly, the Oxford English Dictionary, fun fact, updates. So it's not stagnant. The dictionary isn't always the same. And another fun fact that you can use at parties is that from March 2021 to June 2021, the Oxford English Dictionary added over 700 new words and revised 1,000 words. Fancy, fancy learnings for all of us. So now we go on to definitions. And I would be mistaken if I did not define the fact that these are how we at CAEH talk about these terms. They might be different from how you and your specific community talk about them, but I want to be clear, this is the definitions that we have adapted. My lovely director, Randalin, will be popping some links into the chat that are going to link you to the sources from which we took these definitions so that you can read up more about them. So the 4 definitions I'm going to chat about before handing it off to Randalin help set the foundation for functional zero. We all are here because we want to end homelessness. So let's talk about what that means from these specific definitions. They're all included in a document we have about functional zero that she's going to pop into the chat for you, and so you can revisit it at any time. So we're going to talk about homelessness, housed, chronic homelessness, and veteran homelessness. So first up, we have the definition of homelessness. At CAEH, we combine 2 different versions of homelessness. So first one is from COH, the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, which Randalin will put a little link in the chat for you. So it's when someone is without safe, stable, permanent, appropriate housing, or the immediate prospect or means and ability of acquiring it. It fits into some typologies. So someone could be unsheltered. Their homelessness is unsheltered. Perhaps they're in an emergency shelter. There's provisionally accommodated. So that means something like couch surfing, or they're at risk of homelessness. So that's how the COH defines this. This definition was created in 2012, but then in 2017, it was revisited and updated. Just further emphasizing that definitions can change. So Reaching Home, they took that definition from COH and they've adapted it themselves. So the first paragraph here I won't read because that is the definition we've just talked about. But what our friends at Reaching Home have done is they've added that second component, which then identifies systemic and societal barriers. So the two used together are what we mean when we say the word homelessness at CAEH. So in any webinar or resource that we talk about, this is how we are defining it and what we mean by the term homelessness. When we talk about housed, the easiest way I would explain this to someone is that it's the flip side and that complementary version of homelessness. So if homelessness is when you are without stable, safe, permanent, and appropriate housing, then being housed is when someone has safe, stable, permanent, and appropriate housing. So that would be our definition, and it's complementary of CAEH. So chronic homelessness. We're going to break it down into the two words. We already know what we mean by homelessness, so now we're going to talk about chronic to marry the two together. Chronic is looking at a state of time. It's a condition. So it refers to anyone who is experiencing homelessness and has one of the following criteria. So they have a total of at least 6 months or more in the past year they've experienced homelessness, or they have reoccurring episodes of homelessness that add up to 18 months or more out of the past 3 years. This is the reaching home definition that they came about in April of 2019, and Randalin will put it in the chat if she has not already done so. This definition has a few layers. So while you need that aspect of time, there's also a bit more conditions in it. One is that it does not include time spent in transitional housing or public institutions. A caveat with that is that if someone, let's say, experienced chronic homelessness prior to entering either transitional housing or a public institution, they retain that status when they leave if they exit into homelessness upon leaving those institutions. The simplest way I can explain this to someone, bringing it back to the Einstein quote, is that it's a time freeze. So if you're wondering, transitional housing and public institutions, the time in there doesn't count. It's as if it's frozen. So you wouldn't count it if someone wasn't experiencing chronic homelessness, and you wouldn't take it away from someone who was experiencing chronic homelessness in terms of that length of time. Now, when we talk about veteran homelessness, we're still talking about that same definition of homelessness. And when we say veteran, we're adapting the definition from our friends at Veteran Affairs Canada. So when we say veteran, we mean anyone who is a former member of the Canadian Armed Forces, along with any former members of Allied Forces, RCMP, reservists, civilians, and former Canadian Rangers. So all of these definitions provide the foundation for what my dear colleague Randalin will talk about in Functional Zero.
Thanks, Jess. And before I jump into talking about Functional Zero, I just want to talk a little bit more about definitions, particularly housed in homelessness. And it seems simple to define something and share the definition that you've adopted with partners in the community, but it is very important to have conversations about the interpretation of those definitions. And the reason that we want really solid definitions is because it informs who is coming on and off of your by name list, which is what it will inform whether you've achieved Functional Zero or not. And so the earlier you can have these conversations, the better. And so, you know, even the definition of housed and thinking about what constitutes stable in your community. And it's not important that you're exactly the same as the community next to you or across the country. It's important that everyone in your community has a shared understanding. And why that is because it often comes down to certain locations in the community or certain buildings in the community about whether or not we really think that is a safe and stable place for someone, or whether we would still consider them as experiencing homelessness because it's temporary, it's not safe, they don't have any residential protections, things like that. And so it can be challenging because you will have differing opinions in your community, specifically about a building, right? About whether or not that constitutes housed or not. But if people are interpreting it differently, that means they're also updating your by name list differently. And it does become kind of easier to highlight these issues as your numbers get lower, but there's nothing harder than seeing your community reduce and then realizing you're on different pages about a definition and then seeing your numbers go up because you changed a definition, right? And so Just for the purposes of progress and motivation and keeping things moving forward, it's just important to have those conversations earlier than later. And some of the same questions come up around homelessness, particularly, I would say, around provisionally accommodated. So, you know, if someone is staying on someone else's couch, but they have a key, is that considered homeless? Do they have a place to stay? Those are really important conversations to have. And again, the unique context of your community plays into that. So it's just not enough to just adopt a broad definition and assume everyone's on the same page about it. Okay, so all of that being said, we're going to dive into a bit more on functional zero. And we're talking specifically about two definitions, chronic and veteran homelessness, and how we achieve functional zero on each. So first thing to note, functional zero is a dynamic milestone, indicates the community has solved homelessness for a certain population. Reaching the milestone is in service of building a future where homelessness is rare, brief, and non-occurring. So the important part about functional zero is it does have thresholds associated with it. It's not an absolute zero. So the goal isn't to get to zero and hold that zero. That would be really nice, but we know that homelessness is dynamic. People are constantly coming in and out of it. And our goal is to ensure that that number stays low and that the experience is rare, brief, and non-occurring. Initially, the definition does come from our friends at Community Solutions in the US, who originated Built for Zero. So lots of opportunities to learn from them and the definition that they use. It does indicate that they have solved homelessness for a specific population, and the two that we're focused on are chronic and veteran. So I'm going to do a quick walkthrough of each of the definitions, starting with chronic homelessness. So chronic homelessness is really straightforward in my mind. It means that there are 3 or less people experiencing chronic homelessness on your quality by name list. For our larger communities with more than 4,000 people experiencing homelessness, overall homelessness, then you're on either your by name list or your most recent point in time count. We would want to see that as 0.1% of the total number of individuals experiencing chronic. So they would have to be in that chronic definition. The other piece that's important about this is it does need to be sustained for 3 consecutive months. We want to ensure that it is that we're getting consistent results. We know that things happen in communities that can either drive up or drive down the number of people experiencing chronic homelessness in a community. And so we're trying to make sure they've achieved functional zero by having them demonstrate that for 3 consecutive months. So that's the chronic one. It's pretty straightforward. Our other one is on veteran homelessness. And this one is a bit newer to us in that we just took on a veteran cohort in January 2020. And we have had our first community achieve this, which is fantastic. Shout out to London, Ontario. But it's a little bit more nuanced than the chronic definition. So in this case, a community has ended veteran homelessness when the number of veterans experiencing homelessness is less than or equal to the number of veterans a community has proven it can house in a month. So a little bit more detail on that. The threshold is based on the community's 6-month average housing rate for veterans. And the number of veterans experiencing homelessness has to be held at or below that threshold. Or 3 or less actively homeless, whichever is smaller, for at least 3 consecutive months. So if you're a community and you're housing 4 veterans a month on average, you must have 4 or fewer veterans experiencing homelessness at the end of each month. And again, we need to sustain that for 3 consecutive months. So in this way, the community has shown that the capacity of the system to house veterans is greater than the demand. So those are our two functional zero definitions. And I mentioned London, Ontario achieving functional zero on veteran homelessness, but as I'm sure many of you have heard as well, that Medicine Hat has achieved functional zero on chronic population. So we're really pleased to have those proof points for each of the different populations. A little bit about how we confirm the process. So for folks that have been around the sector for a while, you probably remember, I think around 2015, when there was a lot of coverage that Medicine Hat had achieved had ended homelessness in their community. And at that time, they were using a different definition, and they were using a different definition because there was no agreed upon definition at a national level. And so with functional zero being introduced, it did give them an opportunity to work towards something that is being nationally recognized. And they have been able to do that. And so they have gone through our confirmation process, as has London. And this is a consistent process that we're introducing so that we can have this shared national understanding of what it means to functionally end homelessness. The first thing we do, of course, is starting with the data. Always start with the good stuff. For both of these communities, they were able to demonstrate by name lists, quality by name lists for quite a while. Medicine Hat in particular was able to go back and backdate data for a number of years so that we can monitor that progress and really feel confident about the data that they have. It's reliable each month, it's balanced each month. They've gone through our by name list scorecards to demonstrate that they have things like adequate coverage in their community. And so we want to feel really confident in the data, and we start asking questions about when we see things, numbers go up and down, and what is behind that, to help us understand the factors and the system changes that did occur. This process is led by an improvement advisor or a trainer with either our Built for Zero or TTA program. And so they work through a full checklist and develop a community case study. Not only do we want to feel confident about the data, but we also want their community to feel confident about it as well. And that includes partners that work with them to make sure, if anyone has questions about the data, if they, we're looking at 3 people experiencing homelessness and an outreach worker is saying, hey, I know 5 people like that are not even on that list. Like, these are the conversations we want to have early on and get everyone on the same page and supportive about the methods we use to achieve this. And then once the community has those 3 consecutive months at or below the threshold, we go through that checklist, we do the community case study, and then they're confirmed at functional zero. And then the work does not end there. Achieving functional zero is fantastic, but the hard work is in sustaining and keeping the numbers below that threshold. And so we continue to work with the community to support them in continuing to sustain. And then we also encourage them to move to a different population in the Zero for All cohort, which is looking at achieving that functional zero goal for everyone experiencing homelessness, and not necessarily just chronic or veteran. So that's a little bit about the process that we use, a bit about functional zero and how we talk about it. And that kind of brings us to the end of the part we wanted to talk about, but we are happy to answer any questions that you might have. And again, you can pop those into the Q&A and ask hard questions. We're okay with any of the stuff we talked about being questioned and engaging in those conversations. So please don't be shy. And so while you're all thinking, because I don't see any questions right now, Jess, was there anything you wanted to add about what I had said that I might have missed?
Nothing you missed. One thing I just wanted to add, at our last learning session, Jamie from Medicine Hat, their wonderful team lead and champion, she had this amazing quote that I think about a lot, which is once you get functional zero, you want to protect your zero. So I think that's a great way of thinking about sustain, is you want to protect that threshold. And I just thought that was the coolest term.
Nice one. All right, I see Sarah has put a question in the chat here. Can you expand on why there are different definitions of functional zero for chronic and veteran? Yeah, I can take a stab at this. I think it's a learning process, to be completely honest. One of the reasons we talk about is that chronic is a temporary condition. So we're actually trying to end chronic homelessness so that there is no one experiencing that population is not experiencing homelessness at all. Whereas with veteran, it's not a temporary status that you hold. It's a status you achieve through your involvement. And so we will, again, always have people moving in and out of homelessness, and their veteran status won't change. And so that one is more about the capacity of the system. But I think it's a good question, Sarah. And I think that, I definitely have conversations on my team about the strength of both approaches. And I think we're learning a lot about that now, particularly when it comes to measuring progress toward functional zero, because it's quite different watching a veteran community versus a chronic community. And so I think we're learning a lot. And so, I mean, if you have thoughts, if you like one better than the other, I'd like to hear about that too. So yeah, it's a conversation, but I think it is also very much about the type of population and the chronicity hopefully being a temporary piece. I don't know, Jess, if you wanted to add to that.
No, that was perfect.
Sarah says that makes sense. Thanks, Sarah. And likes both ways. Yeah, I also think that there's benefits of both. But it's good to see communities achieve this and be able to learn from their actual experiences as well. Okay, friends, I don't see any other questions. If you think of something later on, please connect with myself. I think, Jess, if you pop to the next slide. Oh, Sarah's got one more. She's typing. We can go to the next slide. It just has my email address on it. If folks do want to reach out and chat more about definitions, about functional zero. Oh, and Sarah's asking if we have a template for a data dictionary. Do you have one of those? I know someone else on our team is working on pulling together some of that, but I don't know if there's anything that you would know of on the Built for Zero side of things, Jess.
Not for a template to like slot in your own definitions. The only template I know that holds our definitions is that functional zero document for right now.
Yeah,
but it is in the works.
Yeah, and as we make something, we'll always want to share it. So we'll definitely make sure that folks have access to it. All right, folks, thank you so much. Oh, wait, one more question. I get super excited when I see questions. What data are you looking at to indicate forward movements toward functional zero? Are you using a dashboard? Yes. So the communities that we work with through Built for Zero and through TTA do have what we call a performance management tracker. It has a number of different dashboards to monitor their progress toward everything from a quality by name list to reductions below their baseline. And then as their numbers start to get smaller, we do introduce a functional zero dashboard as well. And so they are kind of behind the scenes, but Gina, if you'd like to see an example, I'm happy to screen grab one and share it with you if you want to connect with me via email or anyone else. But yeah, we do use a visual dashboard for folks to be able to monitor that progress.
There's also, if you wanted to take a look at some of our dashboards, there are public facing dashboards that we have that Randalin has created, which show just some public facing information. The PMT goes deeper. but if you want just a little sample.
Mm-hmm. And there's one other question too here about how intersectionality is accommodated. So for example, a female veteran experiencing gender-based violence who is chronically homeless. So kind of 2 points about this. I wish Amanda DeFalco, who's our lead on veterans, I wish she was here to answer the gender-based piece, because I do think there's a lot of interest right now, particularly in the veteran world. And just like in other populations, I think, females are more likely to experience hidden homelessness. They may be less likely to reach out for services, either housing and homelessness services or veteran services. And so that's something I know Amanda works quite closely with communities on, ensuring that there's all the appropriate ways to identify people by name lists. But in terms of folks who are experiencing chronic and veteran, many of our communities report both populations, and they do overlap. And so, yeah, when a community achieves a quality by name list, we invite them to report subpopulation data, so that we can figure out who's chronic, and within chronic, families, adults, youth, and Indigenous, and then they report veteran, but there is crossover between those populations and they show up in both places. And also, just want to add, we're also exploring other socio-demographics that might be worth plugging into that, including gender, as a way to both monitor progress and visualize those results. And yeah, so it's a great question. Short answer, they show up in both chronic and veteran. And one more question, will the recording be available to review? Yes, it will. So it's on our TTA website, which is training.caeh.ca, and you'll see webinars and recordings. Oh, I'm supposed to launch a poll. Let me launch the poll. Sorry, this felt like you were just like almost out of here. So a couple questions we just want to ask you, because we're an improvement organization. We love to improve. And so if folks could take a minute to answer some of the questions just about today's webinar, we would be super grateful. They're all multiple choice. So if you have an opinion that's burning and you want to share it with us, again, just please contact either myself or Jess. Jessica's email is the same as mine, just with Jessica. So I'm going to give folks a couple minutes to finish this. There is a Q&A in here. The measure is a bit confusing to me, and where did the numbers for chronic homelessness come from? So again, we did take learnings from Community Solutions and adopt that definition. I don't know that there is a whole lot of difference between, do we make the threshold 3 people or do we make the threshold 5 people? It's really about decreasing those numbers, but then the real work, as I said, is after ensuring that chronic homelessness in particular is short, reoccurring, and brief. Jess, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I interpret the question a little differently. It's like we're defining what we mean. So if we're looking at where do the numbers come from, so they come from your by name list, specifically a quality by name list. Then we collect a specific set of data that we look at 6 different data points. So we look at actively homeless. That's the snapshot of everyone experiencing chronic homelessness at the end of the month. Then we look at that inflow and outflow. So that's where we get the number for how many people in a community is experiencing chronic homelessness, which would then lead to Randalin's response of where did we get that measurement for functional 0 to come from?
Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you to the 63% of you who just participated in the poll. That is a high response rate for our for an online survey. So thanks for all of your participation, your good questions, and please feel free to get in touch if you have follow-up ones. I hope everybody has a fantastic day, that you spend it thinking about definitions and all those important conversations that need to be had in communities. Have a good one. Thanks, everyone.